You ever think you know exactly how your day will go, and then one small moment changes everything? I thought it was just another long afternoon, staying late at school to finish grading papers. But then, something happened that I never expected. And it happened in that quiet, empty classroom. Before I tell you what Matthew said to me that day, I want to know, where are you watching from? Tell me your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. It was already past 5, the low winter sun spilling long golden stripes across the rows of empty desks. The kind of light that makes everything look softer, quieter, like the day itself is exhaling. The building had mostly emptied out. I could hear the distant hum of the janitor's vacuum somewhere down the hall. I was at my desk, red pen in hand, halfway through a stack of essays. My shoulders ached, my coffee was cold, and I was already thinking about going home to a silent apartment. That's when I heard the soft creak of the door. Matthew stepped in, hesitating in the doorway. He wasn't just any student. He was in his early 30s, older than most of the others, a man who carried himself differently. There was always a kind of thoughtfulness in his eyes, like he saw more than he let on. "Hi, Sandra," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. I looked up, surprised. "Matthew? You're still here?" He shrugged, his hands in his pockets. "I was hoping I could talk to you for a minute." The way he said it made me pause. It wasn't casual. His voice had a weight to it, and his gaze lingered on me just a little longer than usual. "Sure," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Is everything okay?" He walked in slowly, the heels of his boots clicking against the linoleum, and sat down in the desk right in front of mine. His nearness made the quiet feel heavier. I could smell the faint scent of his aftershave, warm and woodsy, mixed with the cool air from outside. "I didn't want to bring this up in class," he began, his tone low. "But I've been meaning to say something." The way his eyes held mine made my heart beat just a little faster. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the intimacy of the empty room, or maybe it was the way his voice softened, as though what he was about to share was something he'd carried for a while. I tried to smile, to keep things light. "Well, you've got my attention now." He laughed under his breath, looking down for a moment before glancing back up at me. "You're different, Sandra. You actually listen. You make me feel like my words matter. That's rare." I wasn't expecting that. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Compliments like that, ones that feel honest, have a way of slipping past all the walls you put up. "Well," I said slowly, "I'm glad you feel that way. But Matthew, is something wrong?" He shook his head, his gaze still fixed on me. "Not wrong. Just, I wanted to thank you. You've made this whole experience more meaningful than I thought it would be. You've helped me more than you realize." Something in his voice, a mixture of sincerity and unspoken emotion, settled over me. I could feel the air between us change, the unhurried stillness of the moment wrapping around us. I noticed little things. The way his hand rested loosely on the desk, the small creases at the corner of his eyes when he smiled, the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw. We talked for a while, our voices low, the rest of the world shut out. He told me about why he'd come back to school at his age, the struggles he'd been facing, the nights he'd almost given up. I shared a little about my own life, too. The quiet evenings, the way the classroom sometimes felt like the only place I really belonged. It felt strange and yet natural to speak so openly. Our words drifted into comfortable silences, the kind that didn't need to be filled. The clock on the wall ticked softly, the golden light dimming into a deeper amber. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated. "Sandra," he said, almost in a whisper, I hope this isn't the last time we have a conversation like this." I met his eyes, feeling something inside me shift, though I couldn't name it yet. "Neither do I replied. He smiled, small but genuine, and walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway, the faint echo of his words still hanging in the air. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't in a hurry to leave. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying the way Matthew looked at me in the empty classroom. Not a stare, not a plea, just a steady presence that felt disarming in its gentleness. I'm old enough to know when attention is careless and when it's careful. His was careful. There's a difference, and it's the difference that kept me awake, tracing the rectangle of streetlight on my bedroom wall like it had answers written across it. The next day, the campus moved with its usual rhythm. The clatter of lockers, the long sigh of doors, the choppy laughter that travels in loose groups down the hall. When Matthew walked into class, he didn't seek me with his eyes first. He slid into his seat, opened his notebook, and rolled his shoulders as if settling into something he'd already decided. Only when the room quieted did he meet my gaze, and the small nod he gave me was like a secret folded into the morning. After class he waited, letting the others filter out. I could feel my own composure collecting itself. He approached with a shy sort of purpose, one hand holding a folder that had spent too many hours in a backpack. "Office hours?" he asked. "If you have time." I checked my watch. I had time. I had more than time. "Now it works," I said. The hallway, still noisy, gave way to the softer hush of my office, that narrow shoebox with the short bookcase, and the plant that refuses to die. He came in and sat, placing the folder between us like a truce flag. "I revised the essay," he said. "The one about starting over. I took your note about concrete details. Thought maybe you could tell me if it's headed in the right direction." I read. He waited. The pages carried the clean smell of printer ink and the warmth of his hands. In the piece, he wrote about washing dishes in the small sink of his apartment after a long shift, about how hot water turns the air to a thin fog and makes the window sweat. He wrote about grief quietly, almost sideways, as though it was a neighbor he could hear through the wall. He wrote about his mother's radio, which clicked on each morning just before the news, and the way it felt to wake to a voice that wasn't there anymore. When I looked up, the room had gone so still I could hear the thin buzz of the overhead light. "It's beautiful," I said, and my voice sounded too soft, like a hand resting on a doorframe. "You trusted the small moments. They tell a bigger truth." He drew a breath that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite pride. Something in between. "You always say that," he murmured, "about small moments." "Because it's real," I said. "Because it lasts longer than the big declarations." He nodded, looking down. Then, after a beat, his eyes came back to mine with a kind of decision in them. "There's something else," he said, and slid a second piece of paper across the desk. "I don't want to make things complicated, Sandra. I respect you. I respect the class. I know the lines. This is me being honest. The paper wasn't an essay. It was a note, handwritten, a little untidy. He dated the top corner, a habit I hadn't taught him, and the first line made my throat tighten. "You make the room feel safer than anywhere else I go." I read slowly. He told me his affection was not a secret in his chest anymore, that it had shifted from something he tried to ignore into something he wanted to acknowledge and handle with care. He underlined care. He wrote that he would never ask me to compromise my integrity, that the class mattered, that my career mattered. He suggested, simply, that when the semester ended, if I felt the same, maybe we could sit in daylight at a coffee shop and talk as two people who had met each other at the right time in the wrong place. My eyes lifted from the page to his face. The quiet between us wasn't empty. It held everything. The scrape of years, the weight of loss, the tender newness of being seen. This was the surprise, I realized. Not a grand gesture, not flowers or a dramatic confession, but a careful truth placed on the table between us like fine glass, so neither of us would knock it over by accident. Matthew, I said, and his name felt warmer in my mouth than I expected. Thank you for your honesty, for the way you've done this. He nodded, waiting. Waiting was an act of respect. I could feel it. I have to be clear, I continued. While you're my student, I can't. We can't blur anything. You know that. I know, he said quickly. I'm not asking for anything now. I just needed you to know that if your heart is even a little aligned with mine, maybe there's a door we can open later. And if it isn't, that's okay too. I'll still be grateful. I'll still show up. There is a particular kind of kindness that doesn't push. It lets you breathe. It lets you think. I leaned back, letting the chair complain the way it always does, and I studied him in the soft light from the window. The careful way he held himself still, the way his hands were steady, even though this must have cost him. I thought about my empty apartment, about the cup waiting in the sink, about the radio I never turn on because the quiet suits me better. I thought about the attention that had been careless in my life and how different this felt. After the semester, I said slowly, I would like that coffee. The words left me lightheaded, like stepping onto a boat that tilts under your weight and then steadies. He didn't smile wide or pump his fist or say something clever. He took a small breath, the kind you take when the doctor says your test results are normal. Okay, he said, then I'll keep doing the work. We agreed on boundaries the way two adults should. No lingering in the empty classroom at odd hours. No personal messages beyond school business. We would be courteous in the hall and keep our conversations about books and drafts and the shape of an argument. It felt good to say those things out loud. It felt like building a simple fence, not to trap anything, but to keep it safe until the season changed. In the days that followed, we settled into a rhythm. He came to class prepared, sharper than before, as though naming what he felt had cleared the fog off his focus. I found myself teaching with a brightness I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't about him. Not entirely, but it would be dishonest to say his presence didn't color the air a little. The other students noticed only that he was writing better, arguing tighter, smiling more. I noticed the way he left space for laughter now, and the way he lingered a second longer at the door after class to say, "Good afternoon, Sandra," like the words themselves needed to be said carefully. One evening, as the sky lowered itself into a soft blue, he surprised me again. Not with a confession. With initiative. He asked if he could read a piece aloud after workshop, something he'd written outside the assignment. The class agreed. He stood, papers trembling just a little, and began an essay called The Long Way Home. It wasn't about me, not directly. It was about patience. About how some people teach you to sprint and some people teach you to walk. He wrote about a bus that misses its stop and a stranger who explains where to get off next time. He wrote about how gratitude, the real kind, doesn't shout. It shows up early, stays late, and writes in the margins when you've given up on the draft. When he finished, the room was quiet in that sacred way words sometimes buy. A few students clapped softly. I didn't, because sometimes clapping is too small. I thanked him. The class drifted out into the hallway. He lingered, but only long enough to collect his papers. He gave me a look that asked, "Are we okay?" I gave him a look that answered, "We're more than okay, and we're careful." That weekend, I went to the farmer's market alone. The pears were good, and there was a woman selling small jars of honey with labels so neat it felt like handwriting from another century. I stopped at a stall with old books whose spines had been reshelved so many times they wore their history proudly. On a whim, I bought a thin volume of poems, the kind I used to keep by the bed when I was younger and the nights felt longer. On the bus ride home, I read a few lines that said something simple about patience and sweetness, and I thought of Matthew reading softly to a room that knew almost nothing about him and somehow understood anyway. Monday found me in the classroom early, the hour when the building is still stretching itself awake. I placed the book on my desk, its cover catching a slice of light. When Matthew arrived, he noticed it the way people notice things that matter to them. "You like that poet?" he asked, hovering by the front row but not sitting. "I used to," I said. "Maybe I still do." I pushed the book toward him. "Borrow it. Bring it back when it's taught you something new." He didn't reach for it right away. He looked at me as though the gift was larger than the object. "Thank you," he said, and when he took it, his fingers didn't brush mine. We were careful the way a good carpenter is careful, measuring twice, cutting once. That afternoon, he sent a short message through the school platform. "Thank you for trusting me with the book. I'll return it in a week. Also, I submitted to the essay contest you mentioned. I attached the draft you critiqued. Your notes helped. No exclamation points, no extra words, just facts and gratitude." I found myself smiling at the screen in that private way you do when the house is quiet and no one can see you be sentimental. As the semester slid toward its last weeks, I noticed how the sun arrived in the classroom at different angles, how it carried the day more confidently, flooding the floor with wider stripes. Students turned in their final projects, the air full of relief and tension, beginnings and endings. And then one evening, the kind that looks like trouble for rain, but isn't, Matthew knocked lightly on my open door. "Just returning this," he said, holding up the book. "It taught me something new." "What did it teach you?" I asked, taking it from him. "That patience isn't waiting," he said. "It's choosing to hold a thing without squeezing it, choosing to keep it safe until it's time." I felt the truth of that settle around us like a shawl. He lingered only a second, enough to add, "I got an email from the contest. Finalist." He grinned then, unguarded, boyish in a way that startled me with its brightness. "I wouldn't have tried without you." Pride rose up in me, not the puffed-up kind, but the quiet satisfaction of seeing someone step into a room they built for themselves. "You did that," I said. "You did all of that." He shook his head once, gently, disagreeing but letting it go. Then, after a breath that felt like the hinge between seasons, he said, "1 week left." "Yes," I answered. 1 week. We left it there. No promises, no countdown. Just the line we had drawn together, holding steady. But I walked home that night with the book tucked under my arm and the first warm wind of the year cooling my face. The streetlights blinked on, one by one, and the city looked kinder than it had in a while. In my kitchen, I set the kettle to sing and leaned against the counter, thinking about the coffee shop a few blocks from campus, where the windows are always clean and the tables wobble just enough to make you careful where you put your cup. Careful. That was the word of the season, the word that made room for all the others. Respect, gratitude, wonder, yes. I didn't know exactly what would come next. But I knew this. The surprise of that empty classroom hadn't been about breaking rules or rushing toward something. It had been about being seen, about saying, in the plain light of day, I am here, and I am ready to do this right. 1 week left. Then the bell would ring, papers would be returned, names would be called, and the room would open its doors to another year. And somewhere after that, in daylight, in a seat by a window, a careful conversation would begin again, not as teacher and student, but as two people who had taken the long way home and found there was still time to arrive.